today I have a very special guest. I'm honored to introduce to you Dr. Zach Bush, and he is a triple board certified physician and recognized educator on the intersection of the microbiome, human health and disease, and our food production. Zach, I was really impressed with your knowledge and understanding of the coronavirus, COVID-19, and what it is and what it is not, and what is happening in our environment to create the perfect storm in the body. And you brought 3 solid solutions. So I'm so excited to bring all of that to our audience. So can you please start by just explaining to us, what is coronavirus? What is this COVID-19?
Yeah, so coronavirus is not a new thing, obviously. We can track coronavirus in the genome back, some people think 700 years, but there's pretty good data showing that we've got 1,200 years ago human demonstration of coronavirus in our experience. Viruses are very simple genetic information updates that are put out by nature into the environment all the time. There's never a second that's going by where we don't have millions of, if not trillions of new variants of viruses that are being produced by nature, and they can be produced by bacteria, fungi, human cells, certainly any mammal, any animal you can think of, as well as any bacteria or fungi you can think of, is producing this genetic transport of information all the time. So viruses are not actually germs. Like the germ theory that we have around bacteria is much different in function, because bacteria are actually living things. Viruses are just little pockets of genetic information that were developed really at the beginning of biology on the planet. They were really the first steps towards biology being able to function within diverse ecosystems, and they have been the method for adaptation on the planet since the very beginning of biology. So we really have mistaken the application of our understanding of bacteria and fungi and living organisms like protozoa and parasites, and then applied them to viruses as if they were some sort of living organism that was capable of life or overwhelm or attack on our bodies. And in fact, they're not at all capable of doing much of anything other than providing genetic information to the environment. And that can be the environment within our bodies or to the greater environment around us. But there's so few genes within a virus that we can't prescribe like the breakdown of human health in any condition to a virus alone. It has to be a more complex disruption of biology to lead to any symptoms. And of course, even in medical school, we're told, the common cold or flu, the symptoms that we associate with that aren't from the virus, it's from our immune system's response to repair or change in the body. And so viruses aren't per se damaging our cells. Even it's not like the damaged cells that are lysed when viruses reproduce. That's not what needs cleanup. That's very few cells that will end up doing that per se. The ones that actually will invigorate an immune response are the intact cells that are now taking in that new genetic information and then placing, as they do, they put proteins on their surface to say, hey, this is what I'm making today. And then the immune system will go around and look at the situation. And if there's an overwhelming amount of signal from one place, it'll start to remove those cells through T cells and other guys to correct the balance or terrain of the environment. But the immune system is never like fighting against, a virus. Antibodies, antibodies, I believe, play a very small role in the way in which we balance our relationship to viral information. We are engineered, and the viruses are engineered as mechanisms of genetic transport to interact. We are supposed to be absorbing viral information and integrating that, filtering that information, rejecting what we don't need and taking in what we do need. So that's the mechanism of the surface proteins around a virus. When I produce viral information, I coat that virus in my own cell membranes covered with receptors and information to target them towards another host. And I'm sending out my genetic information to update the environment around me, really. And we do this all the time, every day. We do it with large strands of RNA and DNA that we think of as viral. And we also do it with something called microRNA, which are tiny little particles that are the switches on genes to make them behave differently. And so I'm exuding information out into my space every time I talk or every time I, sweat. my urine, stool, all of it's exuding this micro information out into the environment. So we have this really, beautiful dance of genetics around the planet since the beginning of time. And so it's really erroneous for us over the last, 50 years, 100 years to really place all of this, suspicion and kind of maleficent, belief system around these viruses, because they're not even alive. They can't produce energy. They can't reproduce. They're just genetic updates to our system. And if your body is not, ready for genetic adaptation and shift, and there's a lot of toxicity in the body, you have a poor antioxidant reservoir, then you can start to develop symptoms of real necessity for repair. But even that's not a bad thing. When you get a flu and you suddenly spike a fever to 102 degrees, we know that that has really important implications for things like, precancerous cells in the body, detoxification, upregulating the immune system's kind of cleanup system of macrophage. So I believe that fever is a very important adaptation in our survival as a species, as well as as mammals as a whole, that illness is actually a gift. The sickness is actually a mechanism by which we can clean up the body's kind of slow decay of genetic information, or slow, toxification from our environment. And so we need to rethink not just our concept of viruses, but rethink our concept of sickness, and realize the body's always doing the right thing. And if the body's got a fever and feels fatigued and malaise and brain fogged, it's because it's trying to clean stuff up. And if we keep blaming the microbiome or the virome for these things, then we're never going to get at the root cause of the problem, which is we're in a toxic stew. And so this current pandemic that we have is a perfect example of this situation. And we can really, work to understand not just this virus, but all viruses through our current experience. And I hope to help you and your audience today really understand what are the exact mechanisms that we know about COVID and coronaviruses as a whole. And then what are the mechanisms of the environmental stressors that are actually, creating the symptoms and actual death from our current situation. Why do we have this virus expressed right now from nature? Yeah. So since the microbiome and multicellular organisms like humans are exuding this information of genomic shift and adaptation all the time, what's forcing adaptation? And we've got 30 years of science now showing that we are in a massive ecologic collapse on the planet. We are seeing massive climate change. We're seeing massive transitions of soil and ocean health as we start to lose biology in every single sector, from soil, water to air environments. And so that is being driven by a human belief that we are at war with the microbiome. We still think that we have to kill all the bacteria. We still think that strep throat is a result of too many strep molecules. As strep bacteria doesn't cause strep throat. It's an adaptation, screw up of the train that causes the overgrowth of a single species. It's the same thing that we do to a garden. When you go out in a diverse, backyard system and then take a rototiller and till up all of the earth, the first things that are going to come up are weeds, because the weeds are adapted to do rapid recovery of a damaged ecosystem. If we go and spray the weeds, then the ecosystem doesn't recover. And then now we don't have good life. And so now we have to put artificial nutrients and herbicides, pesticides, because we have weak plants coming up. This is what we've done to the human body, is we have surrounded it with antibiotics for the last 50 years. The average, American is now exposed, to, at least one course of antibiotics in a year, but, there's an extraordinary burden of antibiotic usage in our physician clinics, but it pales in comparison to the amount of antibiotics showing up in our meat, poultry, and in our crops. And that, of course, started with genetic modification for Roundup Ready crops in 1996, but that was pre-led by our use of Roundup as a desiccant or drying agent on wheat, which started in 1992. And so we started a full-out military blitz on the microbiome in the 1990s, and we have had a collapse of human health since then. We've obviously had an explosion of obesity starting then, explosion of gluten sensitivity and celiac disease, and our lab has shown the relationship between Roundup, microbiome, and those conditions as you develop leaky gut. then you've got, this massive, decimation of the soil nutrient delivery, which then leads to a collapse of the medicinals of our plants. And so not only are we lacking microbiome, our plants no longer have the medicine to treat the diseases that we would get as we lose the soil of our biology, which is our gut. And so we have, decimated the garden, if you will. We have really done a huge toll. And by the 2000s, we see increasing brain tumors, leukemias, lymphomas in children and adults. We see an explosion of Alzheimer's in women, Parkinson's in men, ALS, MS, autism, attention deficit. Every neurologic condition we've ever described has started going up since then. So we're showing this devastating undermining of human biology starting in those 1990s in a kind of renewed sense. And when I say that we've channeled chemical warfare at this, it literally is that, because previous to 1976 or 74, I guess it was, before we kind of repatented glyphosate as a weed killer and all this, the organophosphates were used in war. And so back as far as the Korea War, but certainly getting into the 1950s and beyond with the Vietnam War, we dumped an enormous amount of organophosphate into the Asian environment throughout North Vietnam and Cambodia. We literally moonscaped that entire jungle system, killing, hundreds of millions of trees, monkeys, lizards, butterflies. We devastated all of life so that we could better see the Ho Chi Minh Trail from the air so we could kill more people. And so that was the war mentality of the organophosphate chemical, is we could dump it from the air and annihilate jungle systems. So over the last couple of years, we've been working on really demonstrating in the United States the exact patterns of Roundup spraying and its damage to the microbiome of the soils. And then subsequently, it's a water-soluble molecule, goes into our river systems, kills rivers, and we have the biggest, ocean dead zone in the world right at the end of the Mississippi River. The dead zone, no fish, larger than the state of Rhode Island now, and the threatened zone around that larger than the state of Texas. We put millions of dollars of fisheries out of business and everything else because there's literally no fish left in the dead zone. So we've so toxified the microbiology and life within those structures. So a couple of years ago, I started turning my attention to China for the reason that China is now producing way more glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup, than any other chemical company in the world. So we started, as that chemical came off patent in 2007, we really saw an epidemic of, farm and agricultural abuse of this chemical because it got so cheap coming out of China. And China is now the highest spraying region in the whole world. And the bulk of that spraying in China focuses into the central China, right around Hubei province. Wuhan sits right in the middle of Hubei, essentially. And so you're in now central China, and the toxicity in the soils have reached a level where I know the microbiome has to be putting out stress signal at an extreme rate. Like we have to be sending out, massive adaptation signals, massive, genomic shift so that life can survive in Wuhan. So I've been saying that there's going to be an epidemic of some virus coming out because the genetic stress is there. When we absorb this genomic information halfway around the world, we are getting a message of a stress signal from the other side of the planet. And so now we need the adaptation skills. It's, I believe, really moving across the world to tell people, get ready, there's something happening that is going to require an adaptation. So not only is coronavirus very real, I believe it's very important. Like this is a critical piece of biologic adaptation that we need. And this is not the first time we've seen a coronavirus come out of this exact area of China. Of course, in 2002, we saw SARS, and it was another coronavirus that created the exact same syndrome, which we'll come back to later as to how patients present with this, because it's very important to point out that it's not a viral infection that we present with. If we're going to become critically ill and potentially die, we are presenting with symptoms that don't have anything to do with an infection. Some great studies coming out of New York City showing that. So, but before we even get to like the human experience of taking on this information, we need to really look a little bit deeper as to what's going on specifically in Wuhan. Why Wuhan? We've been told, well, there's some like open animal market in the middle of China. Well, there's open animal markets all over Asia. Like there's nothing remarkable about having an open animal marketplace. Many people, I think who are in the food safety industry would say that it's much safer to have, a natural, open air market than it is to have styrofoam plastic wrap pieces of beef that were packaged in factories with hundreds of thousands of cattle being slaughtered every month as we have in the United States. And we recalled 18 million pounds of beef last year from toxic E. coli and the rest. So I would argue we have a more toxic, food system and food delivery system than any, open marketplace, peasant farmers. They all are doing it cleaner than we are. We have the most, chemicalized, most damaged food system in the United States. And so we need to not damn the Chinese people for a slightly more, populist approach to food distribution. They're doing it better than we are. They have much better food security than we do in the United States. It's a whole nother topic, I guess. But the point being, it's not likely that suddenly this one animal market in the middle of all of Asia, which has the largest population of, you look at all of Asia, a couple billion people, it's not like these markets are causing anybody any illness. These markets are a natural part of the environment. What's not a natural part of the environment is actually the protein industry in Wuhan. And so they outsourced or took on rather the Western world's approach to chicken and pork production, where they're doing it in enclosed environments where they are forcing an enormous amount of antibiotics into the feed of chickens and swine to try to keep them alive in these very toxic stews of environment. The pigs are now so buried in antibiotic, you can imagine what's happening in their stool. Their stool in the United States, like in North Carolina with Smithfield and all this, is now deemed a biohazard, and it's illegal to transport that across state lines. So in North Carolina and in Wuhan and the like, we have to build these huge levees where we store billions of gallons of pig stool that is stewing in these pots of antimicrobial stress. And out of that is coming a virome that's, hard to imagine. Every bacteria capable of producing new viral information. Now you multiply that by quadrillions and then put that into lakes of stool that are too big to measure. You can imagine the generation. Now, it turns out that if you overlap the maps of glyphosate spraying on crops with protein production, Wuhan and Hubei province are the epicenter. Then there has to be one more really potent mechanism needed to create a pandemic, which is transport of the virus through the air effectively. And it turns out that long evidence has shown that influenza and SARS, the coronavirus there, as well as the coronavirus that we see today, is all capable of binding to air pollution. And air pollution in China is focused out of Beijing, and it gets pressed down by the air currents coming down from the north, Beijing being just north of Hubei. Now you can start to see a situation where you have the most toxic agriculture, the most toxic protein production, and carbon particulate in the air that can bind those viruses and carry them very long distances. And so we have the perfect opportunity. So the last couple of years I've been saying we are at risk of creating a massive viromic shift, and I don't think the viruses are to blame here at all. They're only trying to help keep biology up to date. They are the genetic transport communication network. So it was not out of fear of the virus, it was out of fear of collapse of the planet that I've been saying watch out, because we've got to get ready for either a devastating shift in the microbiome coming out of Hubei, or we could take some proactive steps and stop spraying so much, change the protein industry, and create a healthy food system for China. And then we're going to see a drop in all of this, genetic adaptation that's been necessary for the virome over the last 30 years. And so that's what I've been preaching. I didn't have any idea it was going to come out so soon. I thought we were a few years away from maybe the next one, because the pathway for coronavirus is typically kind of every 10 years, 2002, 2012. So I've been telling people maybe, 2022, somewhere in there, we'd be at risk for our next kind of shift to happen. But as we know, the degradation of the planet is accelerating. And so now it's been, a 7 or 8 year gap from our last resolution of a coronavirus shift. But we've got a coronavirus shift. There's a new RNA protein in this new coronavirus strain. We haven't been able to figure out what that protein does exactly, but I have some theories that aren't even worth mentioning right now because they're not important to this conversation. But that RNA strand is interesting to me because I think it's going to reveal something about the new stress that we're putting on the microbiome of China through outsourcing all of our chemical industry there. So now we have PM 2.5. I'll describe that quickly. So carbon particulate in the air is a very potent predictor of death of all kinds. And so whether you're talking about lung cancer or infectious diseases or autoimmune diseases, they seem to correlate highly with the toxicity of small carbon particulate in the air. The term PM 2.5 just means particulate matter less than 2.5 microns in size. And so to give you a sense of how big 2.5 microns is, let's see, 1 micron is 1/1000th of a millimeter. So if you can picture a millimeter on your ruler and then picture 1,000 of these little particles stacked up, that now you're at the particulate matter that's in the air. So too small to see. It's airborne, comes sucking right into our lungs, into our deepest air pockets very easily. And so PM 2.5 has been a massive problem for respiratory disease in China and everything else. They've made extraordinary efforts over the last few years to clean up Beijing, but nonetheless, we see these extraordinary particulate levels in Wuhan that are about anywhere from 20 to 200 times higher than we see in New York City here. So massive amounts of air pollution. So now you've got a viral plume of stress coming out of the microbiome in China, binding to all of this PM 2.5 that goes up into the stratosphere and travels around the world. Viruses have been traveling the planet for eons, since the beginning of biology. And instead, now we have the CDC and other groups trying to paint us a picture that, oh, this airplane took off from here and there was a passenger on it that carried the virus over here, as if somehow the virus is waiting for 4.2 billion years for humans to invent airplanes so they can move around the planet. Not how things work. It's just, that's not biologically true. And so what are they talking about? Are they just lying? No, they're not lying. They're just telling you a very small piece of the puzzle, which is respiratory droplets. So we know that viruses can be suspended in the liquid of a respiratory droplet, and it can usually go about 3 feet from our body. And so we have this little cloud of respiratory around us that is one of the mechanisms by which we communicate. We communicate through hormones, pheromones, redox signaling molecules, viral genomic information, exosomes, all this cool stuff. So we're like this cloud of genomic, endocrine information that we walk around with. And when you see somebody you love, you're recognizing them on 100 different levels, 1,000 levels, millions of levels, because you're interacting with every cell in their body when you come into their presence. And that is a good thing. We know that the more community you have, the more people you connect to in a day, the healthier and longer you live. Every blue zone in the world has totally different diets, different climates. We've been trying to figure out, why do people live over 100 years in these blue zones? And the answer came back through the mathematical algorithms that it was simply the community. If people have strong multi-generational community and stay connected to a big social group, they tend to be much healthier. A cool study was done recently looking at flu and the symptoms of that. And it was showed that if people got more than 7 hugs a day, they had a 35% reduction in getting the flu. And I love that. It's just like, we've got the wrong model of, oh, we need to be afraid of each other. We're passing disease. No, we're actually passing genomic information for a stronger immune system. And if we have a strong immune system by our constant interaction, we are very resilient. In the United States, where we've really crushed this thing down, we see the highest death tolls coming right out of New York, where nobody's walking on the streets and they're still climbing. And, we're not changing things by isolation. We know that isolation causes a drop in immune system function. As I go through this next bit of information, it'd be good if everybody kind of keeps in mind of social distancing, masks, everything else. Like, if we are to believe that this is a deadly virus passing around, then these things make sense on some level, even though they don't have any real scientific testing or validation. At least they kind of pass the sniff test. Okay, there's some virus that passes from human to human, which already we've mentioned that it actually passes through the air without human droplets. But nonetheless, if that paradigm is it, then the messages that we're getting kind of make some sort of sense. But when we back up and realize there is no virus that has all of the complex mechanisms that it would take to cause, the death that we see through the syndrome that's been described in the hospitals, we have to back up and say, well, what are they dying from then? If a virus isn't enough to do this, then why? And if most people who get COVID are either not even aware they ever were sick or have a mild, kind of couple days of fatigue, headache, and then it's gone, if most people are having that virus and it's a completely benign experience, then there must not be something in the virus itself that is capable of inducing death. It must be part of a much more complex thing. So that was, the obvious effort that I went into at the beginning of this, was to start to understand, all right, how is the patient presenting who's really going to die from this condition? And we knew almost immediately that it was hypoxia. And so this is not new. We saw this with the last, situation with SARS in 2002. People would turn blue. And then in the description of the SARS from one of the guys on the front line in China, they say patients show up blue and then they have to wait until their lungs eventually fill with fluid, and then they die of subsequent organ failure and pneumonias. That presentation is very important because the lungs is where we think of the injury being, of like, oh, we've got this, huge respiratory failure going on, therefore they can't breathe, therefore they're blue. But if you've ever seen with somebody with pneumonia, you realize they never present blue. They actually usually present vasodilated. They look like they just ran a race. They're a little pink in the face. They're working really hard. They're breathing really hard. You're fighting for every breath. But these patients are actually quite relaxed. They're comfortable. Their respiratory rate might be slightly elevated, but they're not having any difficulty exchanging air in their lung or anything like that, but they're blue. So this was described with the last coronavirus, which is very important again, because there's been some conspiracy theories around maybe it's just 5G radiation, there's no virus and all this. No, we have seen this long before 3G, let alone 5G. This is an old pattern. And so we should have, figured it out in 2002, but we didn't as physicians and scientists, because we had been told there was this horrible virus called SARS. And we had just, in our fear paradigm, I think failed to ask the deeper question of, does that even make sense? Today, we're getting, great data that we need to look at carefully, because we're a very big risk of this thing being over the next couple of weeks. And we don't go and learn what we were supposed to learn again. And we go and face this thing another 8 years or another 20 years. And so, or another 3 years at the current pace that we're going. So we have to learn from our patients. And when I left the university in 2010, after 17 years in academic environments, I started learning better than I ever had, because it was just me and my patients in rural Virginia in an impoverished little town of 550 people. And I was the doc. I saw everything. I was stitching people up. I saw their colds, flus. I saw their cancers. I saw their substance abuse, their familial abuse, sexual trauma. I saw it all. And what I learned in that space was that being a physician is about sitting and listening again. And I got to be a better diagnostician than I ever had in the universities, because I was looking at my patients. I was listening to their story, and their story is a perfect biologic assay to show us exactly what's happening. I don't need a CT scan or even blood work anymore to know over the last 20 years, how did this patient get to be in my exam room with this constellation of symptoms? Because I listened for a long time. Over 2 hours of listening, you will put the patient's whole life together. You'll actually know why they're in the abusive relationship they're in. You'll actually know why their child left home and did drugs. You'll figure all of that out by listening, rather than doing a bunch of busy, fancy tests. And so we need to take that discipline of real human intuition, human quantum physics, quantum computing capacity that we have, and apply that to the story that's coming out of this situation. When I started looking at this, the reports coming out of China and everything else, it was like, oh wait, this is not pneumonia at all. And other people were saying, not just me. And so then I just kind of started going down the simple process of, right, I'm going to start listening to these patients, and starting to look at the public health patterns. It told me the bigger story. Okay, why Wuhan? Well, I knew why Wuhan. I've been talking about that for years. Okay, so there's huge microbiome stress. This thing comes out. We know PM 2.5 is there. So where's PM 2.5 going to travel? Again, this is air pollution. So it's going to travel across the oceans and going to hit very predictable pathways. Now, you can have respiratory droplet passage of virus too, and that's going to give you some erratic kind of conditions that might not just follow the air current. So it's going to start popping up all over the world, but it's not going to be linear. It's not like it passed from patient 1 to patient 5 like they want you to think. This thing is dispersing through all kinds of mechanisms of biology and air currents and ecology. A nice study coming out of Europe a couple of years ago showed that viruses were showing up in ice caps and in deserts at the same pattern across the world as they were showing up in humans, to suggest that it doesn't take human presence to move viruses around. They move through the air currents and everything else. So respiratory droplets go about 3 feet, but airborne particulate viruses that are tagged to a piece of dust or pollen or some other tiny carbon molecule that you would find in the carbon waste from transportation or energy systems is going to carry it very far, thousands of miles, maybe all the way around the world a couple times before that thing is neutralized. So I think these viruses can persist very, very long in nature. The fact that we can find them in ice caps and all of this stuff would suggest that they're far more stable. So why do we say that the virus only lasts for 3 days? Well, that's true if it's in a respiratory droplet. Water is the most potent detergent on the planet. If you drop a Navy ship that weighs thousands of tons of steel into the bottom of the ocean, it's going to be gone over the next few decades because the water will completely absorb all of that massive steel. And so water is a detergent. It literally is here on the planet to be the ultimate, final say in recycling of energy and materials around the planet. So when you put a virus in a droplet of water, it's going to have an oxidative effect on that virus, and it's going to break it down faster. If you have an airborne virus that has a protein shield that doesn't require water to maintain the protein structure, but then gets carried by air currents and is umbrellaed across the world on dust or smoke particles and all of this, we're going to get coverage around the planet very quickly. So that was happening, starting back, probably November, something like that. Our first, descriptions were coming out at the end of December by China, but it's pretty clear that, again, there was no patient zero. They've made it clear there is no patient zero in China. Even the epidemiologists haven't been able to track it all the way back because they're now realizing things were coming out. So the viruses are always present far before we as physicians suddenly realize this doesn't look like a typical pneumonia. So you can imagine how many flus, colds, fevers, everything else was happening in October, November, December before somebody finally said, hold on a second, this critically ill patient turning blue, this reminds me of SARS. And that's what happened with Dr. Wu in China, is he had actually been on the front lines with SARS, and he recognized the pattern. He's like, I haven't seen this in 18 years, but this looks like SARS. I'm afraid we have a new coronavirus out there. And he ended up being spot on. And the Chinese government, he died of complications of some condition a couple weeks later, or I guess maybe a month and a half or something. But now he's been, deemed the highest Medal of Honor in China, the Martyr Award, for his recognition of this condition.